It started on a quiet evening in Ochi, the kind of evening where the air feels heavy, and every sound carries too clearly. Apostle Johnson Suleman had just returned from a long day of ministration, unaware that far away, a dangerous plan was already in motion. Somewhere deep within the forest that bordered the outskirts of the town, a group of men gathered around a large wooden crate. Inside, cold and restless, were two massive pythons, creatures so large their thick bodies seemed to pulse with menace. These were not ordinary snakes. According to whispers among the men, they had been specially prepared through strange rituals, their minds conditioned for one purpose only, to kill. The journey of these pythons into the heart of Ochi was shrouded in secrecy. At night, the men moved carefully, avoiding the main roads, their flashlights briefly cutting through the darkness. They knew exactly where they were going. They believed the snakes would succeed where human efforts had failed. They believed the apostle was protected from human attack, but maybe, just maybe, these creatures could breach the spiritual walls surrounding him. By the time the crate reached a hidden spot near Apostle Suleman's compound, the streets were empty. A few stray dogs barked in the distance, but no one saw the figures vanish into the shadows. The lid of the crate was lifted slowly. The pythons, sensing freedom, uncoiled themselves in deliberate, almost unnatural movements. Their bodies slid across the ground silently, their scales reflecting the faint light of the moon. Inside the house, Apostle Suleman was praying. His voice carried softly through the quiet, every word deliberate, every breath steady. Outside, the snakes drew closer. Step by step, they moved as if guided by an unseen force, slipping under the outer gate and towards the main building. Suddenly, something happened. The first python stopped mid-slither, its massive head lifting off the ground as if it had struck an invisible wall. The second one hissed and recoiled violently, its body twisting in agitation. The men who had released them, watching from a distance, exchanged worried glances. They had been assured that these creatures could not be stopped, not by walls, not by weapons, not by prayers. But what they were seeing now unsettled them. Inside, Apostle Suleman had changed the tone of his prayer. He wasn't aware of the pythons yet, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. Outside, the snakes suddenly began to thrash violently. One struck towards the door, only to recoil again. The other turned and lunged at something unseen in the air, as though attacking a presence invisible to human eyes. The men watched in disbelief as both snakes suddenly turned on each other. The fight was savage, bodies coiling and constricting, fangs flashing under the moonlight. The ground seemed to tremble under their weight. Within minutes, one lay motionless, the other bleeding from deep gashes in its scales. And then, without warning, the surviving python began to retreat, fast, sliding back the way it came, leaving behind the lifeless body of its companion. When the sun rose the next morning, there was no sign of the surviving snake, but the dead one lay sprawled across the compound's edge. Word spread quickly among the locals. Some said they saw strange lights in the sky that night, others claimed they heard a thunderclap though no rain followed. Apostle Suleman, upon hearing what had happened, simply smiled and gave thanks, saying only, "No weapon formed against me shall prosper." But the men who had sent the snakes knew this was more than a failure, it was a warning. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, the python that had fled carried the memory of something far more powerful than anything they could control. The python that escaped that night slithered for hours, moving with unnatural urgency. It did not stop to hunt or rest. It cut through streams, pushed past thorny bushes, and vanished into thick undergrowth, guided by something stronger than instinct. By the time it reached the forest heart, the moon had shifted, and the men who sent it were waiting. They had not slept. They sat around a dying fire, tense and uneasy. The leader of the group, a tall man with a deep scar running down his cheek, had been muttering to himself since the snake failed to return as planned. When the bushes rustled, they stood quickly, expecting victory. But the sight before them chilled their blood. The python was alone. Its massive body was streaked with blood, some fresh, some dried. And its eyes, they no longer looked like an animal's. There was a strange, glassy brightness in them, as though something else was staring through. The leader took a cautious step forward, speaking softly in the dialect they had used during the ritual. But the snake didn't stop. It moved straight toward him. At first, They thought it was just agitated from the fight. But when the python suddenly lunged, wrapping its thick coils around the leader's legs with terrifying speed, the others froze. He screamed and tried to pry himself free, but the strength in those coils was inhuman. The snake tightened, the sound of bones straining echoing in the still forest. The other men rushed forward with sticks and machetes, striking at its scales, but each blow only seemed to make it faster and more violent. In a blur, the snake turned on them, forcing them to scatter into the darkness. No one saw exactly what happened next, but when the survivors crept back hours later, the fire had gone cold, and the leader's body was nowhere to be found. Only deep drag marks led into the darkness, marks too wide to be from a normal snake. From that night on, the survivors began to speak in whispers about a curse. They claimed the python was no longer just an animal, it had become a messenger. Some swore they saw it weeks later, coiled silently in the path, watching them from a distance before slipping away. One by one, those involved in sending it against Apostle Suleiman began to suffer strange fates, sudden illnesses, unexplained accidents, sleepless nights haunted by visions of coils tightening around their throats. And in the town of Ochi, Apostle Suleiman continued his work, untouched, as though the entire attack had been nothing more than a shadow passing in the night. Weeks had passed since the first deaths, but the last surviving man from that night could feel something closing in on him. His name was Ademo, and he had become a shell of himself. His eyes carried a constant redness from sleepless nights, and his skin looked pale under the weight of fear. He had moved far away from the forest, taking refuge in a remote village where no one knew his past. Yet, every night, he woke to the same sound, a faint dragging noise, like something heavy sliding through grass. At first, he convinced himself it was only in his mind. But then he began to notice strange things, his goats disappearing without a trace, deep coil marks pressed into the soil near his compound, and that heavy, unnatural silence that came just before dusk. One night, as the wind rattled the wooden shutters of his small hut, Ademo heard it again, that slow, deliberate sound of scales sliding over the earth. This time it was closer. Much closer. His breath caught as he gripped the cutlass he kept beside his bed. He told himself he would face it once and for all. The sound stopped just outside his door. Then came the faint hiss, low and stretched, like a whisper in the dark. His hands trembled as he pushed the door open. The moonlight revealed it. There, in the center of his yard, the python lay coiled, larger than he remembered, its body glistening like polished stone. But the most terrifying part was its head, slightly raised, eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that felt almost human. It didn't strike immediately. It just stared, the tip of its tongue flicking in and out, tasting his fear. Ademo swung his cutlass in panic, the blade slicing through the air with a desperate cry. The snake moved with terrifying speed, avoiding the blow and closing the distance in a heartbeat. Its body hit him with the force of a battering ram, knocking the cutlass from his hands. Before he could reach it again, the coils were around him. The pressure was unlike anything he had felt before, bones creaked, his lungs screamed for air. His nails dug into the thick scales, but they might as well have been stone. In the moonlight, he saw something impossible, the faint outline of a handprint on the snake's head, glowing faintly, as though marked by a power not of this world. As his vision dimmed, Ademo heard a voice. It wasn't the snake speaking, yet it filled his mind clearly, "Touch not my anointed." The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the python releasing him, letting his body drop lifelessly to the ground. And then it turned, sliding back into the shadows, leaving no trace but the deep grooves in the earth where its massive body had passed. From that night, the killing stopped. The python was never seen again. But in Ochi, the story was whispered with awe that something unseen had risen to defend Apostle Suleiman, and that those who dared to touch him had faced a judgment far more final than any man could give.